Hi everyone, and welcome to another Risk Awareness Week workshop. And today I wanted to talk about a hypothesis I had for quite a while, and let's see if in this debate we can kind of come to some sort of agreement, and whether you take my side in this, I think, very interesting and very challenging professional risk management debate. So my hypothesis is that risk analysis is only useful when it guides a specific decision. And that means organizations should do different risk analysis, different risk assessments for different decisions. And basically, whenever there's a decision taking place, risk analysis should support that decision. And there really is no place in my view of the world for enterprise-wide risk management, where we're trying to capture the holistic picture of risks. There is a place for capturing holistic view of risks that's called liquidity risk management, but ERM and integrated risk management and all the other kind of fancy keywords have no place in practical world. And in fact, if your risk assessment, if the risk analysis that you're doing for your organization on a quarterly basis, on a monthly basis, on a semi-annual or annual basis, unless it's connected to some sort of specific, very practical and pragmatic decision, it's pointless. That's the argument I'm going to make today. And stick around, let's see if you agree with me. So a few words about my experience. I really should update this slide. I've been working in risk now for over 18 years. I started my career in Australia, worked in the Middle East, CIS countries, and now I'm working in Europe and Brazil. I've been doing, as part of my day-to-day job, head of risk, head of insurance, head of internal audit roles. And in parallel to that, I've been kind of doing some training at MBA classes and executive education classes. And I created Risk Awareness Week because I feel very passionate about spreading the messages about risk-based thinking and application of quantitative risk analysis in decision-making. In 2021, both PERMA, which is the European Association of Risk Management, and RIMS, which is the US Association for Risk Management, gave me and my team awards for the best of the best and successful implementation of risk analysis, which we're very proud of. So before I begin and kind of dive into some of the examples, I wanted to quickly share and take a screenshot of this page. These are the books that encourage me, that inspire me. These are the books that anybody who's thinking about understanding risk management better or thinking about working in risk management, these are the must-read books. Like, this is the selection that explains what good risk management should look like. And the one thing that I want you to observe is that most of these books have no word risk management in the title. I mean, the only exceptions are kind of Norman Marks and my own book. And Doug Hubbard actually called his book The Failure of Risk Management, which is kind of the opposite. But the point I'm trying to make is that most good risk management books have nothing to do with risk management. They're based in the fundamental sciences of probability theory, decision science, neuroeconomics, behavioral economics, all the actually scientific field studies that are required knowledge for a professional to be good in risk management. So please take a picture of that slide. I think these books, if you haven't read them yet, I highly recommend. So now let me kind of dive into some of the examples. I wanted to prove my point that risk analysis is pointless unless it's connected or it supports some sort of specific decision. I wanted to illustrate that point by sharing a couple of case studies that my team and myself, either at the current place of work or the previous companies where I worked, have done, and we felt it made a significant difference. Well, I mean, so much so that I was named the best risk manager in Europe in 21, and we've got the best international ERM implementation award from RIMS the same year. First one, the shareholder and the CFO came to the risk team saying, how can we calculate expected losses from operational risk? How can we quantify operational risk so we can account for it during budgeting? And how can we quantify operational risk so we can account for it when we allocate and stress test our risk capital? And that, to anybody working in financial services, that would probably kind of mean pretty specific things. For the rest of us outside of financial services, what this basically means is that we needed to understand, and this was across multiple chemical plants, we needed to understand the loss distribution, the loss exceedance curve for the operational risk specifically, to figure out two important parameters. Parameter number one, well, actually three important parameters. Parameter number one, expected losses. We needed to calculate expected losses so we knew what sort of value, what sort of amount of money we expect to lose due to various operational risks throughout the year. And therefore, this would become our indicator for how much we should be spending on preventing those risks and mitigation. But also, this could be an indication on how much reserve we need to put in the budget, so the budget is kind of risk adjusted. That's number one, expected losses. Second, we needed to calculate unexpected losses. And unexpected losses are very useful because if we're trying to, it's basically kind of a plausible worst case scenario. So we're trying to calculate that to figure out, okay, well, if the plausible worst case scenario happens, like the stress scenario happens, how much capital will we require to not go bankrupt? How much capital will we require to cover the operational risk? So this was important for liquidity planning and liquidity management to understand how much risk capital we need to allocate for operational risk. And again, is this an excessive amount? Should we actually spend money mitigating the operational risk instead of just allocating risk capital to it? Or is it kind of within the appetite of the shareholder? And then, so that's the second thing, unexpected losses. And then the final thing is the tail of the distribution. And that's basically, we need to understand, well, what's the maximum probable loss that a particular plant can sustain from an operational risk event. And that's different from a complete loss, because, I mean, yes, there's this highly unlikely scenario that a meteorite will fall on your plant and it will be completely wiped out. But that's highly unlikely and usually kind of outside of your confidence level. So instead, we're looking for kind of for maximum probable losses, plausible scenarios where if something explodes, then yes, it will probably destroy within a specific area, and it will damage this part of the operation, and the operation will be out of action for 6 months or a year or 2 years or 3 years. All of these scenarios are kind of identifiable and documentable. So we needed to understand these three things. And this is exactly what we attempted to do. Now, if anybody is working in financial services, you know that normally you would look at loss data. You would look at registers with loss events, and then you would estimate the frequency and the distribution and the loss distribution, simulate them two together and figure out what's your expected losses, unexpected losses, and the tail event. Now, this was an amazing exercise because we very quickly figured out that loss data was not available, because we did go to the plants. We went to quite a few plants and we asked for the loss data, incidents, incident investigation, near misses, all the typical things, only to discover that the items that were in the registers were not reflective of reality. They were missing so many events that we know happened, but there was no record of them in the register. So what we found is that we actually had limited and sometimes very little loss data that we could easily use. So we had to use proxies instead. We started looking for, well, what are some of the proxies that can indicate a risk event? And that was gas usage, electricity usage, water usage, production starts and stops, equipment maintenance budgets. So we started looking for different indicators, kind of secondary indicators or root causes, trying to root cause is probably not the right word. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, write in the comments what's the right word that I'm looking for. Looking for kind of hints of risk event, even if the incident is not captured anywhere. We were looking for any deviations, any unusual volatilities, any significant ups or downs in the system data, and we were able to discover that actually the operational risk was much larger than if we were to just judge it by the loss incident data, and that allowed us to calculate the distribution for different plants. And at the time that I was doing that, we were successful in calculating for a couple of 2 or 3 plants out of large portfolio of chemical plants. So that's still ongoing work. But this was, in my experience, a very interesting study, because what we've done is, A, we had a business problem. How much do we need to budget for risk in a given year? How much risk capital do we need to make sure the company is sustainable and doesn't go bankrupt? How much insurance do we need to buy? And what is the fair price for paying for insurance? And I'll give you another case study on fair price, because that actually made a huge difference. We ended up saving more than $10 million on recalculating what the fair price of insurance should be. So we've answered 3 very important business questions. And this whole exercise didn't start with risk managers trying to come in and say, oh, why don't we quantify operational risk? No, it came with the business or the shareholder asking the 3 questions, and then we figuring out a methodology to respond to these 3 questions, to solve these 3 decisions. But the second positive thing for me is that we've actually borrowed pretty much 80% of the methodology that banking uses under Basel III for operational risk. And what this means, and this is something that I'm a big proponent of, and this is why I encourage everybody to watch Risk Awareness Week 2019, 2020, 21, 22. Do not reinvent the wheel. The chances are that you're somehow faced with a unique risk that nobody on the planet has ever dealt with, are so remote that whenever you're tasked with trying to analyze risk, you should always start by trying to find who has done it in the past, what has been the methodology, have they been the next example I wanted to share is another instance where the risk team was approached by the shareholder and the compliance team, basically asking to come up with a methodology that would be simple yet quantitative and would allow to prioritize the risks based on prioritize compliance risks based on their effect on cash flow, on company cash flow. And what the risk team ended up doing, again, without reinventing the wheel, whenever you have a risk which doesn't have some sort of standard, industry standard for quantifying it, and again, I've looked at the work done by COTO and ISO on compliance risk, and it's embarrassing to say the least. Their proposal to assess risk as high, medium, low is not risk management. It's voodoo science. I mean, it's just embarrassing that they both publish this. So we immediately dismissed that as a waste of time. So, and in fact, our conversation with the shareholder started by saying, I do not want to see another heat map ever again, and we need a better methodology that actually maps our compliance risks to the effect on cash flow. And what we attempted to do, without reinventing the wheel, we go to our kind of little toolbox for risk analysis, and whenever there is a risk that is kind of qualitative in nature, which doesn't have a predefined methodology for quantifying, like market risk or credit risk, bow tie or a decision tree or an influence diagram is usually the go-to solution. So in this instance, we selected the bow tie diagram. It's a blend between the bow tie and the decision tree. And so what we ended up doing is we ended up quantifying a couple of scenarios, kind of starting from no impact to mild impact to moderate impact to catastrophic impact with prosecution, legal costs, fines, cleanup, and so on. So we went through a number of scenarios, talked to calibrated experts across the organization, tried to capture the scenarios for each of the compliance risks, and then we mapped them. We mapped expected losses versus unexpected losses on the map to make sure they're represented in matrix, because for some reason people still love matrices, and even though the underlying risk analysis was quantitative, we still represented it as a matrix, so people can kind of see visually that some risks are more important than others. Although that's equally visible if you just calculate conditional VAR. What was interesting, by the way, for this compliance risk, but it wasn't obvious initially, but when we deep dived into one of the risks, what we realized is that VAR was not an appropriate metric for compliance risk because they're very heavy-tailed. It's like nothing happens, nothing happens, nothing happens, and then a catastrophe, which is super unlikely, but then immediately your costs just explode exponentially. And we instead used expected shortfall or conditional VAR, which is a different metric, much more useful for such risks. And by the way, I've done a workshop, I think last risk awareness, we're kind of deep diving a little bit into this methodology. And if you scan the QR code on your screen, I think that should go to the workshop for you to see. So again, this was a decision. This was a decision that the risk team was approached by the compliance team, asking them to come up with a methodology to reprioritize the risk. Both of these examples are very high level. So it was originally designed as a very high level, semi-artificial methodology. It looks quantitative, but at the end, you don't really do risk analysis to prioritize risks. It's not like that's not the end game. It's a very kind of immature application of risk analysis, but nevertheless, we were approached by the team and we've done the risk analysis. Here's another methodology that I felt was was important. The CEO approached the risk team asking to stress test the 5-year business plan before the business plan was presented to the Ministry of Finance. Again, it wasn't like we were just sitting there waiting for and initiating different stress tests. It's the business plan was being prepared to be presented to the Ministry of Finance, and as part of that preparation process, as part of that decision how to structure the strategy of the company for the next 5 years, as part of that decision, a fundamental block was whatever the business comes up with, whatever assumptions the business comes up with, the risk team had to stress test the assumptions, run the simulation, and see how sustainable the business plan was. And this was, again, an amazing case study because the first business plan that was drafted to be presented to the Ministry of Finance had an 80% probability of failure. So it was actually a very, very risky. The assumptions that were made were overly optimistic, and they didn't pass the stress test. So we ended up doing the stress test, run multiple 10,000 simulations, showed the conclusions, showed which are the most unrealistic assumptions to the management. And management ended up revising the business plan. So the new odds and the little graphs on your screen, you can actually, these are kind of cash flows for the next 6 years. The cash flow kind of for the first 2 years, it's all positive. Then there is some probability, like a 20% probability of negative scenarios. Then 15% probability of negative scenarios. Then 5% probability of negative scenarios. But then something happens in year 6 where it's almost 50-50. 50% chance that the cash flow will be positive and 50% chance that the cash flow will be negative. So again, an indication, a hint that the strategy is quite risky. But the business plan that was presented to the Ministry of Finance at the end had a 70% probability of success and 30% probability of failure. A failure meaning that basically the company will require additional government subsidy or funding to continue to implement the strategy. And what's interesting, this has been done many, many years ago. And what's interesting, it actually turned out to be pretty accurate. The company did survive for a few years, and then it had exactly the type of liquidity problems that were forecasted by the risk team. But again, this was a wonderful case of an organization trying to make an important planning and forecasting decision, and risk analysis is not separate, is not an afterthought, is not independent, it's not standalone, it's not after, it's not quarterly, it's an integral part of that planning process. The plan that doesn't pass the risk analysis does not get presented. The plan goes back to the drawing board and gets refreshed, readjusted, rethought, and only the version that passes the stress test then becomes the base case for the presentation. And again, I think I did a little deep dive into this case study. You can scan the QR code and have a look at it. Another fascinating example, so remember how we've done compliance risks? We actually ended up deep diving into some of the environmental risks. And what we found is that we started with a very basic kind of 5-branch bow tie, but what we ended up with was a much more in-depth, complicated 24-branch bow tie, because the reality, the legislation, the intricacies of understanding the risks was much more complicated. There were administrative fines, there was criminal prosecution, there was prohibition of water discharge or air pollution, which basically has huge influence on the way your production process works. There is the cleanup cost, there is the probability that your plant may be stopped for up to 90 days while the investigation is ongoing. And that obviously has a huge business continuity and business interruption impact for the organization. And again, this didn't just come out of fresh air. This came because an investment team approached the risk team saying, we want to build water purification facilities because we're concerned about the risks associated with water pollution. It's an investment project. It's quite an expensive investment project. It was, I think, tens of millions of dollars to build the water purification plant. And they needed to justify the business case for building the water purification plant by comparing the risk exposure, the expected losses and unexpected losses before the plant, and expected losses and unexpected losses after the plant. And this was, again, a very amazing exercise, because this request allowed the risk team to kind of to really deep dive into the issue, understand the legislation, work extensively with the environmental team, work extensively with the operational team, and show, and this is what's so curious about deep diving into risk analysis. And by the way, as you can see from the title, I call it advanced risk management. advanced risk analysis, because before stuff was kind of high level business plan, 5-year, like big horizons, compliance risks overall. This is the really deep dive into a specific decision, specific risk analysis. But the curious thing is that what we showed is that the way the water purification plant was originally designed did not actually reduce the risk exposure sufficiently enough to justify the investment. So we've showed this is the risk exposure, like this is how much risk we're sitting on every day while we're not building a water purification plant. However, if we do build the water purification plant with the configuration that was originally designed, it would not reduce the risk significantly enough, so we would still have too much risk in exposure. So the management ended up changing the configuration of the water purification plant to reduce the risk further. I mean, this is why it's so critical to do risk analysis as part of the decision making, because the decision that is on the table, chances are, is not optimal. And chances are, once you do the risk analysis, you realize that the original decision is not appropriate for the risk that it's facing. And sometimes, quite often, we actually made significant changes to the underlying decision to reduce risks further. And again, I deep dived into this topic, I think, last year. And you can watch my workshop from Risk Awareness Week 2022. But this is an amazing example, and this is another reason why this is an amazing example, why it kind of supports the case study that I'm trying to build for risk analysis is pointless unless it supports the decision, is that this type of work requires weeks and sometimes months and of work with quite significant mathematical and technical underlying research, study, modeling, and so on. This is a lot of work. And what I'm trying to say is that unless you deep dive into a specific risk and do this amazing, very deep technical risk analysis, you are unlikely to discover the true understanding of what the nature of the risk is, what the risk profile is, and therefore you have no chance to be helpful in finding the appropriate mitigation, because you have no idea whether the original design of the plant is good enough to reduce the risk, unless you've actually broken down this risk into this specific model and you've simulated without and with the mitigation and so on. So this requires a lot of work. Don't underestimate just how much work is involved in deep diving into a specific risk. And what I'm trying to say is that realistically, in a given year, a risk management team can deep dive into 2, 3, 5 specific risks, okay, maybe 7, but that's pretty much it. There's no chance you can deep dive with sufficient level of detail into every single risk in your corporate risk register. And that's why I'm saying that the real value comes in from deep diving into a specific risk where you spend a lot of effort trying to understand the actual technical implications of that risk. You model, you simulate, you run multiple scenarios on that risk. And that's where the real kind of value, and I think the next example is all about value. This is us building, the CFO came to us and saying, I'm not particularly comfortable with the budget that we have for insurance. I'm unhappy on two fronts. One is I'm not confident that we're insuring the right risks. And second, I'm not confident that what we're paying for insurance is appropriate given the risk exposure. And so to answer these two questions, we obviously had to calculate. We took it one renewal at the time, so you can't take all of the insurances because, again, this requires a lot of work. We spent months and months on each renewal. It paid off. And when I'm saying it paid off, we saved $13 million in a single year. That's enough to pay for the whole risk management team for the next 10 years with all the bonuses, salaries, travel, software costs everything. We paid for ourselves for the next 10 years. And it was lovely presenting this result at the board, saying, well, quantitative risk analysis pays off because you spend a lot of effort, but my God, you make a lot of money for the company. So in my mind, like, it's never really a challenge, a question, qualitative, quantitative. To me, it's a moot point. It's you either save millions or you prepare colorful heat maps. What's the? It's quite an easy decision. So anyway, we ended up creating a calculator, like a model for each of the renewals, trying to calculate what is the risk profile, what is the loss exceedance curve for the risk that we're trying to insure before insurance. So we knew what the expected losses were, what the unexpected losses were, what the maximum probable loss scenarios were, and that required sometimes working with risk engineers, collecting a lot of data, speaking with underwriters and brokers, collecting a lot of data from them, even though they don't want to share. It's the whole thing. It requires a lot of time. And then, once you understand what your underlying risk profile is, you can actually calculate what the fair price of the insurance should be, and then you can conduct marketing roadshows, speak with the underwriters, present your risk profile, explain why your risk profile is different to the industry average risk profile and why you shouldn't pay industry average prices, if indeed your claims data support that point. What we found is that sometimes we were able to reduce the cost of insurance by 15%, 20%, and that 20%, that's $1.3 million in every single year. I mean, it's pretty nice. But sometimes we reduce the cost of insurance by 7 times, 700%. I mean, that's just insane. That's just insane how different the conversation is when you know what risk you're actually insuring, comparing to what everybody else is doing, and filling in the questionnaires that the underwriters are sending. Here's a hint: I've never completed an insurance questionnaire in my life because they're asking the wrong questions, and instead I'm preparing a submission document which describes the actual risk that we have and all the controls that we have in the organization. So insurance is a great example of when we have a decision: do we renew or not renew? What sort of parameters do we renew? Do we need more limit? Do we need less limit? Do we need more deductible? Do we need less deductible? All of these decisions are calculatable. And what is important to understand is that all of these decisions requires quite a significant investment of time and effort in building the model, building the submission, running the roadshow, speaking to the underwriters, and more importantly, calculating what the fair cost of that insurance policy policy should be. So we do this again one by one. Whenever there's a renewal coming up, a couple of months before it's due, we start on this work. It's physically impossible to have a look at your portfolio of insurances and just do quantitative work for all of the insurance, because it takes a lot of effort, and we barely managed to do risk analysis in time for the renewal. And in fact, quite often we have to extend existing policies for a month or 2 months just so we have more time to conduct risk analysis. And this is something that I've just had a conversation today with one of the risk managers in Australia about this. This is something that I think people often use as an excuse. They're saying, well, doesn't quantitative risk management delay the decision? And in reality, of course it does. It quite often delays the decision, because what you realize is that it's impossible to make the decision right now, because it would be a bad decision, and you need extra time to perform the risk analysis and then adjust your decision. But more importantly, nobody ever held it against us as the risk team, because it pays off. Yes, you delay the decision, but then when you save $3 million of 5.7 million, again, which is a real thing that happened to us, 5.7 million, because you delayed the decision and you didn't expose the company to any extra risk, you found kind of an intermediary solution. And yes, you maybe even paid for the intermediary solution, but you ended up saving so much that it pays for everything back. And you got better quality coverage, better limits. Most of the time, by the way, in our risk analysis, which is, was kind of a surprise to me, most of the time we found that our limits were insufficient. So we ended up doubling, tripling limits on most insurance policies. We didn't really touch deductibles. So every single time we saved millions of dollars, we actually improved the quality of coverage. So we got better coverage, cheaper. This is just mind-blowing stuff. And this is the power of quantitative risk analysis. Okay, and I think this is the final example that I wanted to share to kind of to prove my point. Again, the shareholder and head of procurement came to the risk team saying, we want to automate vendor accreditation. We want to make sure our procurement process, and it's a large, it was at the time, it was a large $10 billion organization globally, 3,000 vendors, and it was a primarily manual process, heavily dependent on individuals making the decision whether somebody is a good vendor to work with or not. And we needed to quantify that. And of course, market has a lot of solutions off the shelf. They come in, they claim they have 150 risk factors, everything automatically checked, and basically the system gives you the recommendation. Accredit them or not accredit them, and work with them or not work with them, and what sort of credit limits would be appropriate for a particular vendor. And the procurement team and the shareholder came to the risk team and said, can you please check, because this is an important business decision, who do we accredit and who do we re-accredit, and how is the performance of that vendor accounted for in the methodology? How do we avoid basically bad quality, counterfacts, and write-offs for all the advances paid but the work never delivered? How do we reduce the credit risk and the performance risk in procurement through kind of quantitative risk analysis and automation? And what we've done, and this is just absolutely mind-blowing stuff, because we were speaking at the time, we were speaking with, I think, like 5 or 6 biggest vendors in the market. Everybody claiming that they have this amazing product, 150 risk factors, 170 risk factors, 100 risk factors, they're all amazing. And the first question I would ask is, show us your backtest. Can you show us an example of a methodology where you've run some predictions and then you've actually tested those predictions against reality and you were able to confirm whether the methodology actually works? And I found this absolutely amazing, because once we started testing the prediction power, so first of all, we asked, where's your backtest? And only one Italian company was able to share a backtest with us. The rest had no backtests, which is kind of big red flag for anybody in risk management. If somebody claims the methodology is working, but they don't have a backtest, and by the way, all the methodologies that I showed before, we had a backtest for each one of them. Some of them performed better, some of them performed worse, but nevertheless, backtesting your methodology, your promises to the management is kind of it's risk management 101. That's a given. So we asked for backtest. Nobody sent it to us except one company in Italy. And for the companies that didn't send it to us, we had to perform our own backtest. So we asked for some data. Luckily they've given us the data, and we were able to perform the backtest on our vendors and their assessments. What we found was absolutely hilarious. The models that they were selling and promoting as best practice had a 70% error rate, which means more than 70% of good vendors would be classified as bad, and kind of and vice versa, bad vendors would be classified as good. But more importantly, out of 150 factors, we found that only 30 made a difference. The rest were just empty marketing promises. They had absolutely no difference to prediction. Like they did not improve the prediction of the model one bit. So they were just basically a waste of space. And so we ended up using 30 out of 150, and we automated what made sense, and that allowed to really streamline and automate the process. But again, the management reached out to us, and this work takes months to perform. So you can't just look at the risk register and say, okay, now I'm going to send an email to all of the risk owners in my risk register and say, deep dive into your risk and perform proper risk analysis and see if you can do this better. Every single risk takes a lot of focused effort working with risk owners and the risk team and all of the the back office. So it's really the risk analysis, for it to be useful, it has to be driven by some sort of business need, some sort of decision. And unless the savings are significant and obvious, you probably shouldn't start the risk analysis, because it's going to take a lot of time. And if you're not saving millions of dollars at the end of it, what's the point? What's the rationale? What's the rationale for that? And this was, I think, a fascinating example. Let me try and summarize some of the points that I've made in this workshop. And by the way, you don't have to agree with anything that I say. In fact, I encourage you, if you're watching this live, in the comments to the right side of the screen, right? And if you're watching in replay, then the comments will be below, underneath. Share your thoughts. What I found in my career in risk management is that if you want value, if you want savings, if you want real difference, you have to deep dive into specific risks. If you want to deep dive into specific risks, it takes effort, time, and a lot of mathematical modeling. If it takes a lot of time and effort in mathematical modeling, you have to do the things that matter most. And what matters most is something where there's a business need, there's a decision to be made, there's some sort of unhappiness or dissatisfaction or some sort of significant losses that need to be reduced or prevented. And the bigger the decision, for example, for strategic decisions, the methodology becomes more high level, more simplified in approach. For budgeting purposes, again, the methodology is more simplistic. For CAPEX planning, by the way, I have another workshop on, I think, Friday. Have a look there. I'll share a specific methodology on how we've improved our CAPEX budgeting through very simple quantitative risk analysis using AAC confidence levels. And since it takes a lot of effort, since you really want to apply yourself for the risk to be reduced and for your risk analysis to make a difference to the organization, you're very selective, and basically you're driven by whatever is important to the business and whatever they want changed, upgraded first. So some key takeaways and key points from me. Risk analysis, in my very strong belief, and whenever we talk about risk analysis that should be driven by a decision, there's this concept that Taleb really likes. He calls it f of x, function of x instead of x. So any risk is a distribution. So there's a function, there's the risk distribution. And that is sometimes useful for insurance purposes. For example, you want to understand the expected losses, unexpected, for budgeting purposes, for liquidity management, cash flow management, understanding unexpected losses and the tail is important. So there are instances when the distribution of the risk is important. But most of the time, when you're dealing with decisions, you're not interested in the distribution of the risk. You're interested in the effect of risk on the timeline, on the budget, on the cash flow. You're interested in understanding the effect of risk, or multiple risks, on something, on some sort of business business metric, and this is what he calls f of x, which I'm a big proponent of. Whenever you're doing risk analysis, your primary focus, your ultimate objective should be trying to understand what is the f of x, what is the function of risk. For example, if we are looking at construction risk, how will these risks delay the start of the plant? How will these risks increase the budget of the plant? So we're not really interested in losses from a specific risk. Instead, we're interested in how these losses and delays from these risks affect the overall project timeline. And it's the same with business plan, with cash flow, and so on. So the second point that I want to again reiterate is that risk is a distribution. Any risk on the planet is a distribution which has expected losses, unexpected losses, and the tail. And risks are not independent. Most of the risks are not independent, so there is an element of correlation. What is interesting, for example, I've just been doing risk analysis for our budget, and I created distribution for all of the foreign exchange rates, all of the inflations, and all of the product prices relevant to our business. And I wanted to see how correlated they were. And of course, all of them are correlated in one way or another. But what is interesting, because we were doing this kind of first time round, so we wanted a simplified approach. What was interesting, I started testing rolling correlation. So basically seeing how correlations changed from year to year. Was it, for example, highly correlated first year, then negatively correlated the following year, then not correlated at all? And what I found, out of, I think, 10 macro assumptions, only 3 had stable, consistent correlations. Everything else was kind of correlated this year this way, the following year the other way. So basically, we choose to treat the other metrics as independent because we saw that even though they're correlated currently, it wasn't always the case. And in fact, just a couple of years back, they were negatively correlated and so on. It's not stable enough to make an assumption that they are consistently correlated. The third point that I want to make, kind of to wrap up this session, is that if you're serious about making a difference, if you want to talk about mitigations, I mean, talking about mitigation at the level of risk register is just lunacy. When you talk about something is high versus low, and everything that you have in your risk register is benign. These are obvious wishful thinking. These are not real mitigations. If you want to talk about real mitigations, how to make real difference, if you want to make real savings from dealing with the risk, you have to deep dive into that risk. That means big, complicated decision trees or bow tie diagrams, detailed bow tie diagrams, understanding the legislation, understanding the intricacies, spending a lot of time with the risk owners, and only then you can make a difference. But I guess the positive that I want you to take away from that is the difference that you make is so significant, it's so huge. It's something that you couldn't even dream about. It pays for risk management tenfold. So you're never in the position where you have to ask for budget and you're like, oh, can I go to this conference or can I do this? It's not really a thing when you're making a lot of money for the shareholders. The fourth thing that I wanted to share is that please don't reinvent the wheel. Most of the methodology, most of the risks have some sort of methodology that was trial and tested before. And this is what Risk Awareness Week is all about. It's about other different risk engineers, risk experts, financial experts, strategy experts, decision science experts coming in and sharing different methodologies that they've tested and that they back tested and that proved to work quite well. So write any risk in the comments, literally any risk you can think of, write any risk in the comments, and I bet I can come up with an example methodology that is used somewhere else that is equally applicable to the problem that you're trying to solve. I cannot think of a single risk on the planet that wouldn't have some sort of good methodology to solve it. I mean, cyber, you think of it. This is just so ironic, and this is why Risk Awareness Week is so important. The underlying math behind cyber risks is 70 years old. It's the same methodology that I used for, it's literally the same methodology that I used 3 years ago for water pollution risks. And it's the same methodology that I used 10 years ago for intellectual property risks. The method, like there's only like 5 methodologies that are applicable that cover, most. I'm exaggerating. Maybe it's not 5. Maybe it's more. But it's a handful of methodologies that can cover most of the risks on the planet that you can think of. Think of a risk, write in the comments, and I'll reply to you with the methodology. And the next point is that there are good methodologies and there are bad methodologies. For example, if you're trying to qualitatively assess risks in terms of green, orange, red, high, medium, low, there's enough scientifically tested research to suggest that no matter how hard you try, the responses that you get by using that methodology will be deceitful and not particularly helpful to decision making. In fact, you shouldn't use qualitative risk assessment methodologies for any significant decision. And again, if you don't believe me, ask me in the comments, and I'll send you a couple of papers. One of the books in the very beginning that I shared, and I hope you took a picture of that slide, is from Doug Hubbard. He literally has a chapter, like a full chapter with references on why heat maps are worse than useless and dangerous for any kind of risk analysis. And remember that Risk Management 1, all of the qualitative risk registers, risk appetite statements, and all of the other things that are really not back-tested in any way, that's not risk management, that's just risk washing. All right, let me wrap up with a few QR codes. There's the blog with articles. If you like videos, there's a YouTube channel, very popular risk management YouTube channel with lots of short videos, pretty much answering most of the questions you can think of. And then, of course, Risk Awareness Week. This is the 5th year running, so all the previous 4 years of Risk Awareness Week are available online and has amazing resources. A while back, last year and beginning of this year, I started publishing some guides. So follow this QR code. There is, I think, more than 10 risk management guides on how to do things, like risk compliance risk, for example. There's literally a step-by-step methodology on how to quantify it. Or there's a step-by-step methodology how not to do risk registers and why risk registers, the way you traditionally probably do them, underestimates the risks by 15 times. The actual risk is 15 times higher than what you report in your risk registers. So again, follow that QR code. And I wanted to leave you with the cognitive bias, which is a favorite of mine, but a Meinhof phenomenon. Once you learn something new, and today hopefully the new message was stop doing risk assessments on annual or quarterly basis, and instead start doing risk assessments whenever the business is making an important decision. Do risk assessments to improve budgeting forecasts, do risk assessments for any new investments, do risk assessments on new large procurement contracts, do risk assessments on technology choices for construction, and so on. Do risk assessments for selecting a new bank. Do risk assessments in your life for selecting a new travel destination, to immigrate or not to immigrate, and so on. So the cognitive bias is that once you learn something new, hopefully you will start seeing the opportunities everywhere, and you'll start thinking, well, how can I apply risk analysis to this problem, which I didn't notice, but now I see it. It was always there. There's always this opportunity to apply risk analysis. I guess the one caveat is that quantitative risk analysis helps you make a real difference. I can't really think of many amazing examples where qualitative risk assessment suddenly brought an epiphany, discovering something which wasn't absolutely amazing and obvious. But again, don't agree with me. Just share in the comments what you think. So thank you very much. I'll see you in other workshops, and enjoy Risk Awareness Week.